Welcome to NTS Perspectives, a podcast by the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. New dimensions of conflict in the Middle East and disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz have impacted oil and gas prices, demonstrating the risk of long-term dependence on fossil fuels and the need for states to grow their renewable energy capacities and supply chains. In Southeast Asia, the ASEAN Power Grid looks to develop a regional interconnected electricity grid system. Progress has been made with 9 of the 18 key interconnection projects operational, and the region is targeting to fully establish the APG by 2045. However, geopolitical risk, including the competition between the US and China, and the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Iran, have implications on these ambitions. This episode will unpack the current state of energy integration in ASEAN, the challenges faced by ASEAN member states in the shift to renewables, and look beyond the region to other best practices of regional energy infrastructure. I'm Danielle, Associate Research Fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies here at RSIS, and I will be your host for this episode. Today, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Mirza Huda, Senior Research Fellow in the Climate and Sustainability Program at ODI Global, and he is based in Singapore. Prior to joining ODI Global, Mirza has worked on energy transitions at the ICES Yusof Ishak Institute, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Nanyang Technological University. He is also an Associate Fellow at the ICES Yusof Ishak Institute and a Research Fellow at the Earth System Governance Project. Hi, Dr. Mirza.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Mirza, what is the current energy mix in ASEAN? Yeah, if you could share with us the latest developments in APG.
Sure. So, in terms of the energy mix of Southeast Asia, we are still very dependent on fossil fuels. So, around 67% of the region's electricity generation is actually from fossil fuels, and around 80% of total primary energy supply is from fossil fuels. So, renewable energy provides around 30% of electricity generation, of which hydropower is the largest contributor, followed by solar and biofuels, which is more or less the same composition in terms of contribution. So we are a region that's very dependent on fossil fuels, and the ASEAN Power Grid is one way to move towards higher levels of renewable energy generation. And this is a very special time for the ASEAN Power Grid. So we are seeing a lot of acceleration and development in terms of interconnections. And there was a renewed momentum towards the APG since 2022 when the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore Power Integration Project was first initiated. And this led to a lot of momentum. And we see evidence of that in the number of recent agreements that have been signed on subsea and overland interconnection projects. So currently, as many as 6 subsea power cable projects have received conditional approval by the Energy Market Authority of Singapore. The monsoon wind power project between Vietnam and Laos came online this year. That's the 600 megawatt wind power project. And in the ASEAN Ministers of Energy meeting held last year under the Malaysian chairmanship of ASEAN, saw a lot of political and governance level progress on the ASEAN Power Grid. So the new APG MOU was signed. There was a lot of progress on the development of a subsea power cable project. And this subsea power cable framework will hopefully be signed during the Philippine chairmanship. Also during the AMM, World Bank and the Asian Development Bank actually came up with a new funding facility for the ASEAN Power Grid. So there's a lot of political progress, which is backed up by actual agreements and growing business interests. But there are also several challenges that we need to address, particularly in the context of finance, some political challenges, and some issues such as the absence of a regional dispute resolution mechanism. But overall, quite a lot of progress.
In the recent years, that there seems to be more movement as regards to the APG. So in terms of subsea cables, what are some of the political implications that had to be ironed out through the discussions?
I think subsea cable projects, firstly, they're a huge opportunity, right? They really multiply the number of buyers and sellers in terms of energy trade. So, say a country like Vietnam is not limited to energy trade just between its land-based neighbors like Cambodia or Laos. So it can essentially sell electricity to Malaysia and Singapore via subsea cable projects. But having said that, there are also multiple challenges. Firstly, there is the issue of supply chains. So the supply chains of subsea cables themselves are very limited. And most of the industries and factories that make these subsea cables are actually located in Europe and North America. It creates a challenge of logistics, so transferring the subsea cable projects all the way to Southeast Asia. And also, all these factories have huge backlogs, so they are completely overwhelmed and booked out in terms of the orders they need to fulfill. So there is that technical challenge, and in terms of political challenges, of course, there are issues regarding the waterways, the exclusive economic zones. So there needs to be a lot of cooperation, not just between the countries that are engaged in these projects, but all the maritime countries in Southeast Asia. Subsea cables can be quite complex, but once you get the first subsea cable project up and running, so for example, perhaps the one between Batam and Singapore, then you can have a proof of concept that you can kind of use to create regional kind of frameworks and ways of communicating, collaborating, and maintaining these subsea cable projects.
So picking off from what you've shared also, Southeast Asian countries are still very dependent on fossil fuels. What are some of the challenges that ASEAN countries face in making this shift towards renewables? And how do you think that they can balance energy security with, the need to decarbonize?
I think the real issue with fossil fuels is current levels of dependence. So it's not just the electricity sector that we talked about previously. It's also about fossil fuels, real contribution to the economy in Southeast Asia. So there are huge industry in countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, where they provide a lot of jobs. They support certain regions, ancillary industries, restaurants, other kinds of services that support the workers. And there's also a lot of fossil fuel interests, business interests in perpetuating the use of coal, the use of gas in the region. So that's a real challenge. And in addition, while the transition itself remains a very economically a viable kind of move, but to actually make that shift requires a huge amount of investment, a lot of money to move away from our dependence on fossil fuel. There's always this conflict between the immediate needs of the economy and the long-term needs. We really need to consider and talk about in terms of looking at the long-term benefits of energy transition. There are also geopolitical issues. So, as you know, there's consistent geopolitical conflicts between China and USA. Now we have the Middle East conflicts, and all these have impacts on energy security. And this can, make governments very sensitive to addressing the short-term interests rather than looking at long-term decarbonization goals and long-term investments. The renewable energy sector can really have a positive impact on employment in Southeast Asia. So, according to one estimate, the renewable energy industry can create around 5.8 million jobs by 2050. So, there's enormous opportunity, and there is a lot of positive progress in some sense. So we see enormous increases in the capacity of wind and solar in Southeast Asia. So in 2023, solar energy capacity increased by almost 6% as compared to 2022. And there are many positive projects being implemented in the region. For example, in Southeast Asia, we have the region's largest floating solar power plant, which is called the Sirata Floating Solar Power Plant, and a joint collaboration between Masdar and an Indonesian company. So there's a lot of progress, but the increase in renewable energy is not consummate with what we actually need to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And there's also increases in fossil fuel capacities in the region. Shocks like the Middle East conflict certainly don't help, because it really increases fossil fuel subsidies, because governments, of course, want to meet the immediate needs of its populations. But at the same time, you also are forced to think about the risks depending on Middle East fossil fuel imports, and think more about how we can benefit by collaborating through the ASEAN Power Grid, through cooperation in the region itself. I think geopolitical conflicts between major emitters is a real contribution to the slowing down of the energy transition, because it kind of really impedes renewable energy diplomacy, and it creates this competitive kind of mindset when it comes to the energy transition. And I think with such a global kind of movement like transition, we really need the great powers to collaborate. But unfortunately, energy transition has become very much a part of energy geopolitics. So one case in point is critical mineral issues. So as people often talk about China's domination of the critical mineral supply chains, and the United States and its partners are really concerned about China's dominance in copper, nickel, lithium, and other critical mineral supply chains. So it's created its own kind of framework towards addressing this, which is the Mineral Security Partnership. And this aims to create an alternate supply chain of critical minerals. And a region like Southeast Asia, which is really trying to develop its supply chains of critical minerals, to develop its economies, to contribute to the global energy transition, is kind of caught in between this kind of tug of war, right? Because Southeast Asia remains a major exporter of ores. So it wants to move away from exporting raw materials to actually exporting finished products like electric vehicles, batteries, and becoming a hub of green industrialization. And for that, it needs contribution by all major players: China, Europe, US. And this kind of geopolitical conflict really prevents that. It's kind of forced to choose sides because of the Inflation Reduction Act, which kind of conflates with very high levels of Chinese investment in the region. And we see that happening to some extent with subsea cable projects as well. There is not much collaboration by the great powers in collectively contributing to these projects. So I think great power competition is a real contributor to the slowing down of energy transition in Southeast Asia.
Moving on to the ongoing war in the Middle East currently, which is at the top of everyone's minds. It has resulted in a spike in oil and gas prices and also in electricity. So, how has this affected the energy security of states in Southeast Asia?
So I think the Middle East crisis has had a huge impact in Southeast Asia, but not evenly, because not all countries depend on Middle East oil and gas on the same level. So the impact has been particularly severe in countries like Thailand and the Philippines. So I think everyone's is aware of the case of the Thai anchor taking off their jackets on air to kind of comply with the government advice to reduce energy consumption. And the Thai government has also asked public servants to stop using lifts and use stairs instead to reduce energy consumption. So it's had a huge impact in Thailand, which is quite heavily dependent on fossil fuel imports from the Middle East. There's also been a big impact in the Philippines. So the GP drivers have protested about the increases in diesel prices in the region. The Philippine governments are considering increasing fossil fuel subsidies, have allowed the use of dirtier fossil fuels, which are cheaper than the ones being imported from the Middle East. So the impact has been massive. Um, I'm not really sure whether this will really create regional consensus on increases in uptake of renewable energy, the need for regional cooperation, not just through the ASEAN Power Grid, but also soft skills such as just transition issues, importance of addressing some of the socioeconomic impacts, moving towards renewable energy, upgrading the skills of workers in terms of addressing smart grid issues, battery storage. So the impact has been quite concerning. It remains to be seen how this experience informs and influences our long-term policies going forward.
You've also previously mentioned a little bit on the need for investments and financing for the transition. How are international partnerships and foreign investments shaping the energy transition right now in the region?
We need a huge amount of investment in the regions. So for Southeast Asia to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, we need as much as $230 billion of investment annually. And there has been some important initiatives being undertaken in the region in recent years. One is the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But the JETP has a lot of challenges. Firstly, it doesn't meet the huge amount of finance that Vietnam and Indonesia needs. So there is a huge finance gap even after the JETP funds are taken into consideration. And then the JETP is mostly in the form of commercial loans, which can create some economic challenges for Indonesia and Vietnam. And the other issue is continued fossil fuel subsidies, which kind of make solar, wind, and other kinds of renewable energy economically unviable. And whenever you have crises like the ones we are facing now, there are increases in fossil fuel subsidies. So, of course, that doesn't help. In terms of international investments, There is the Masdar project that I just mentioned in Indonesia, the largest floating solar farm. There are multiple European partners that have invested in countries like Vietnam. There are also some challenges that they have faced in recent years in regard to bureaucratic red tape that have caused the withdrawal of some of these companies. So I think in Southeast Asia, we do need to create a more friendly business environment for international investors. But at the same time, the geopolitical environment now does not really encourage investment by multiple partners. So, as you know, the withdrawal of US aid, essentially the withdrawal of US from many of the uh, global climate governance frameworks have really reduced the number of partners that Southeast Asia can engage with. So, in that context, hopefully, we will see some of our partners in East Asia take a bigger role. And there are some positive momentum in this regard. So, for example, LS Cables, which is a HVDC company from South Korea, has has agreed to develop a subsea cable project between Malaysia and Langkawi, so the mainland and Langkawi. So this is a very important project in terms of energy security in Southeast Asia. And hopefully we will see more collaboration by some of these partners in enhancing and accelerating energy transition in the region.
On the just and inclusive energy transition, what are some of the social and environmental impacts of renewable energy infrastructure development in Southeast Asia? And so far, has there been any progress in just transition policies?
So let me just give a preface first, right? So the development of renewable energy infrastructure is absolutely necessary, right? And it will have long-term positive impacts. But just like the development of any kind of infrastructure, the development of renewable energy also has impacts which needs to be addressed. So hydropower has a lot of impact on the environment. It also impacts food security to some extent. Solar farms also take up a lot of land, and this can impact agriculture. And then, in terms of developing floating solar farms, this can also impact fisheries. And of course, all of these can be addressed with the right kind of policy. So you can have agrovoltaic infrastructure. So the solar panels can be placed above crops. Certain kinds of crops can be developed that way. With floating solar farms, you can engage with those involved in fisheries, engage with different kinds of stakeholders to maintain the impacts. I think in terms of actually addressing these issues, the JETP has initiated the development of quite a few important frameworks in the region. So, for example, the ASEAN Center for Energy has developed a set of guidelines on a just transition related to the development of renewable energy infrastructure. And this is at a regional level. At the national level, Vietnam and Indonesia has both developed policy frameworks to implement the JETP funds. So for Indonesia, this is the Comprehensive Investment and Policy Plan. And for Vietnam, it's the Resource Mobilization Plan, which actually has very strong just transition frameworks and very detailed outline on addressing impacts on communities, on looking at gender issues, heritage. But these are still at the theoretical level. And there are some challenges that have become apparent. So there is a bit of difficulty in getting public participation. The funding still remains a challenge. So there are a lot of momentum at the regional and national level, but we still need some local capacity, higher levels of finance to implement these policies.
What are some of the examples of regional interconnection projects you've seen from your research that have failed and succeeded? And what are some of the lessons that ASEAN can learn from them?
I think in terms of best practices, ASEAN often looks to Europe, which is understandable. And quite useful as well in many cases because Europe's energy integration is much more advanced than ours. But we may also look at some of the developing regions. And in that context, say the Southern African Power Pool has made a lot of progress over the years. And perhaps one lesson we can learn from the Southern African Power Pool experience is the need to develop a transparent wheeling charge. So the Southern African Power Pool has a transparent formula for developing its wheeling charges. But I think the actual wheeling charges are confidential for business and other political issues. So in the region, there is some kind of feeling or discourse on the fact that wheeling charges aren't necessarily the topic where everybody has consensus. So some of our research on the APG has found that some stakeholders feel that the wheeling charges are too high, others feel that it's too low. So one of the ways to address this kind of lack of consensus is to have open and transparent formula for developing wheeling charges in the region. And the wheeling charges itself can be kept confidential, but if you have a transparent formula, this will reduce the kind of conflicts that stakeholders have regarding wheeling charges and really push forward the regional integration agenda.
Previously in our conversation also, you spoke about ASEAN faces some challenges in the dispute resolution mechanism for the ASEAN Power Grid. So maybe if you could elaborate further also on this aspect.
So ASEAN has a very particular way of resolving disputes. It prefers a negotiation, consultation, which is fine and it works very well for the ASEAN region. But I think for the APG to move to the next stage, higher levels of multilateral trade, it would be beneficial to have a formal regional level dispute resolution mechanism. And this can be like a very formal kind of mechanism like we have in Europe with the energy community, where there is a whole mechanism dedicated to dispute resolution. You have various stages, you have negotiation, third party arbitration, and then a more formal kind of legal way of addressing disputes. And in some of the African power pools, you also have dispute resolution mechanism, and it depends on what they prefer. So some of the power pools prefer a more consultative approach, while others do have legislative mechanisms of addressing any kinds of disputes. So a regional mechanism can really give a lot of confidence to investors. So HVDC projects can take as many as 15 years, and having some kind of platform for resolving disputes can really encourage investment in these very complex and lengthy projects. And it can also perhaps provide platform for not just state to state or business to state kind of dispute resolution, but members of the community can also potentially make any of their concerns known. So I think a dispute resolution mechanism can really advance investment in the APG, but any kind of mechanism must also conform to the political realities of Southeast Asia and be owned by the stakeholders in the Southeast Asian region. So we can't really take examples from Europe or South Africa and just implement that in the region.
What do you think Singapore's role is in the ASEAN Power Grid?
So I think Singapore has provided a real push to the APG. So the LTMS started out as LTM, so Laos, Thailand, Malaysia Power Integration Project in 2018. And the participation by Singapore really gave a lot of commercial viability to the project because of the higher electricity tariffs in the region. So Singapore aims to import 6 gigawatts of electricity by 2035. And this creates a lot of commercial and business interests in these very complex and expensive subsea cable and overland projects. And Singapore also is a great hub for innovation, discourse, through initiatives such as the Singapore International Energy Week, which brings forth stakeholders from all over the world to discuss energy issues. And we do see a lot of interest in collaborating with Singapore as well in the last few years. Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Vietnam aims to import electricity to Singapore. So I think Singapore's continued interest will be very important for the APG, but it remains a regional initiative. So we need all the countries to be involved, interested to drive energy transition through the ASEAN Power Grid.
You've been listening to NTS Perspectives, brought to you by the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Thanks for tuning in.